The Fire Spook of Caledonia Mills. The winter of 1922 in Nova Scotia was defined by a cold that seemed to settle not just over the land, but into the very timber of the structures built upon it. In the remote community of Caledonia Mills within Antigonish County, the isolation was absolute. The snowbanks were frequently high enough to bury fence posts, and the roads were often impassable for days at a time. It was a place where reliance on neighbors was not merely a social courtesy, but a survival mechanism. In this frozen landscape, the farm of Alexander MacDonald sat quiet and unassuming. It was a typical homestead for the region occupied by Alexander, who was a man in his 60s, his wife Janet, and their adopted teenage daughter, Mary Ellen. For years, the rhythm of their lives had been dictated entirely by the seasons and the demands of their livestock. There was no history of criminality at the residence and no record of domestic disturbance that would suggest the chaos that was about to unfold. The events that began in January of that year would eventually draw the attention of journalists, scientists, and law enforcement from across the province. Yet they began with incidents so small they were barely worth mentioning at the dinner table. The initial signs were easy to dismiss as the result of forgetfulness or the settling of an old house fighting against the wind. Alexander began to notice objects in the farmhouse were not where he had left them. A pipe placed on a side table would be found on the floor, or a heavy woolen coat hung on a peg would be discovered in a heap across the room. In a drafty farmhouse during a squall, it is natural to blame a gust of wind or a door left ajar. However, the movement of these items soon defied the physics of simple drafts. Heavy iron pots were reported to shift on the stovetop without human intervention. Chairs that had been tucked under the table were found pulled out or overturned in empty rooms. The family initially tried to rationalize these occurrences. They spoke of vibrations from passing weather or the simple confusion that comes with the long, dark days of winter. But the atmosphere in the house was changing. There was a reported heaviness to the air, a sense of anticipation that made daily chores feel increasingly draining for the elderly couple and their daughter. The situation escalated dramatically from the displacement of objects to the manifestation of fire. This was not the typical chimney fire or a stray spark from the hearth, which were constant dangers in rural life. These were small, isolated ignitions that appeared in places where fire had no business being. The first incident involved a piece of wallpaper in the parlor. Alexander smelled smoke and, upon investigating, found a small blue flame eating away at the paper on a wall far removed from the fireplace. There was no accelerant present and no electrical wiring in the walls. He swatted the flame out with a cloth, confused, but assuming perhaps a spark had somehow traveled an impossible distance. He had barely returned to his chair when a shout from the kitchen alerted him to a second fire. This time, a dish towel hanging on a rack was smoldering. The house was not merely drafty, it was becoming hostile. Over the course of the next few days, the frequency of these ignitions increased to a point that defied statistical probability. The MacDonalds found themselves living in a state of siege within their own home. Witnesses, who would later testify about these events, described a frantic routine where the family could no longer sleep soundly. They began to keep buckets of water in every room. The fires were described as having a peculiar quality. Witnesses often reported that the flames were blue and initially cold to the touch before they consumed the material. They would start on curtains inside closed wooden drawers or along the hem of a dress while it was being worn. Mary Ellen, the young daughter, became a focal point of these occurrences, though at this early stage, she was viewed as a victim just as much as her parents. She would be sitting in a chair only to leap up as the back of her dress began to smoke. News of the events at the MacDonald farm traveled through the community of Caledonia Mills. In rural Nova Scotia in the 1920s, privacy was often sacrificed for collective security. Neighbors began to visit, ostensibly to help, but also driven by a deep curiosity regarding the rumors. What they found was a household on the brink of collapse. During one evening visit, a neighbor watched as a rug in the center of the room burst into flames while everyone was seated several feet away from it. There was no one near the rug and no open grate nearby. The men stomped out the fire, checking the floorboards for heat, but found the wood cool. The fire had seemingly started on the surface of the wool itself. These witnesses were not prone to flights of fancy. They were farmers and laborers, men and women who understood the practicalities of combustion and the dangers of fire. They could not explain what they were seeing. As the intensity of the phenomenon grew, so did the physical danger. It was not just cloth and paper that were targeted. The structure of the house itself began to suffer. Small fires would start along the baseboards or on the wooden windowsills. Alexander MacDonald was forced to maintain a 24-hour watch. He and his wife took turns patrolling the rooms, carrying water, and watching for the telltale wisp of smoke. The psychological toll was evident. Reports from the time describe Alexander as a man aged beyond his years, visibly shaking and exhausted. He was a man who understood how to fight a blizzard or a drought, but he had no tools to fight a fire that started from nothing. The community began to whisper about the cause. Some looked to the family dynamic, others looked to the history of the land, but in the immediate moment, the priority was simply preventing the farmhouse from burning to the ground. The phenomena were not limited to the interior of the house. The barn, which housed the family's livelihood, became another stage for these disturbances. Alexander reported finding the tails of his cattle braided together in intricate knots that would have taken human hands hours to complete, yet had occurred between his rounds of checks. Livestock were found released from their stalls, wandering in the snow or agitated by unseen tormentors. The distinction between the safety of the indoors and the work of the outdoors had vanished. The entire property felt infected by the strangeness. It was during this period that the physical displacement of objects turned violent. Witnesses reported seeing heavy stones thrown against the side of the house from empty yards. Inside kitchen utensils were flung across the room by invisible forces. The sheer volume of the incidents eventually forced the involvement of the authorities. This was no longer a domestic curiosity, it was a public safety hazard. The local police were notified, and eventually a detective from Halifax was brought in to investigate. The arrival of law enforcement marked a shift in the narrative. The objective now was to find a human agent responsible for the chaos. The prevailing theory among the skeptics was that Mary Ellen, the teenage daughter, was responsible. It is a common trope in such cases to blame the youngest member of the household, usually attributing the actions to a desire for attention or psychological acting out. The detective approached the case with this hypothesis firmly in mind. He was a man of facts and evidence, looking for hidden matches, flint, or sleight of hand. The investigation was rigorous. The family was separated and interviewed. Mary Ellen was watched closely, yet the fires continued to occur even when she was under direct observation or physically incapacitated. In one documented instance, a fire broke out in a room on the upper floor while Mary Ellen was downstairs in the kitchen, surrounded by witnesses, including the investigators. The detective searched the house for hidden wires or chemical accelerants. He peeled back wallpaper and lifted floorboards. He found nothing. There were no trick mirrors, no hidden compartments, and no stash of matches. The fires were spontaneous and localized. The detective found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to file reports that detailed events he knew should be impossible. He noted the exhaustion of the family and the genuine fear in their eyes. This was not the behavior of pranksters enjoying a joke. This was a family being hunted. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Caledonia Mills case was the physical contact reported by the witnesses. It was not just that objects moved, it was that people were touched. A neighbor keeping vigil with the family reported being slapped on the arm by an unseen hand. Another felt a tugging at his coat. These tactile hallucinations, if that is what they were, added a layer of visceral dread to the experience. It is one thing to see a plate fall off a shelf, it is another to feel a physical pressure applied to your own body when no one is there. The sensory details of these accounts are consistent. The touch was often described as cold or firm, not a brush of air, but a deliberate contact. This led to a growing consensus among the neighbors that the house was not just suffering from a physical anomaly, but was occupied by a presence. The skepticism of the outside world remained high. Newspapers in Halifax and beyond picked up the story, often treating it with a tone of bemusement or open mockery. They dubbed it a mystery house or a ghost farm. But for those on the ground, the reality was stark. The McDonalds were losing their home. The smell of smoke was permanently embedded in their clothes and hair. The walls were scarred with scorch marks. The water damage from constantly dousing the fires was ruining the floors. The investigation by the detective eventually concluded without a satisfying explanation. He could not prove Mary Ellen was responsible, but he could not offer an alternative that fit within the bounds of the law. He left the farm with the mystery unsolved, leaving the family to face the winter alone. The climax of the events came when the family could simply no longer sustain the vigilance required to stay alive. They had fought the fires for weeks. They had endured the scrutiny of the police and the press. They had lost their privacy and their peace. The decision was made to abandon the farm. It was a surrender. Alexander MacDonald packed what could be salvaged, and the family moved out, leaving the house to the elements. This departure was significant. In the hardscrabble life of 1920s, Nova Scotia abandoning a homestead was not done lightly. It meant the loss of asset, the loss of history, and the admission of defeat. The fact that they chose to leave suggests that the threat was viewed as existential. They believed that if they stayed, they would eventually burn. After the family departed, the house stood empty. Interestingly, the reports of fires and disturbances ceased once the human element was removed. The house did not burn down on its own. It sat silent in the snow. This fueled the theories that the phenomenon was linked specifically to the people rather than the location. The focus remained on Mary Ellen. Years later, researchers and paranormal enthusiasts would look back at the case and draw parallels to other famous poltergeist cases, noting the presence of an adolescent, the sudden onset, and the elemental nature of the disturbances. But at the time, for the MacDonalds, there was no comfort in comparative studies. There was only the displacement and the stigma of being the family from the haunted farm. Mary Ellen never confessed to any deception. Throughout her life, she maintained that she did not set the fires. The accounts from the neighbors who were present during the height of the activity support her claim. They saw fires start in corners of the room where she was not standing. They saw objects move when her hands were visible and empty. The sheer number of incidents, sometimes dozens in a single day, would have required a level of sleight of hand and coordination that would be remarkable for a professional magician, let alone a stressed teenager under constant watch. The logistics of the hoax theory simply did not align with the observations of the multiple independent witnesses who had no reason to lie. The legacy of the Caledonia Mills fires is one of unresolved tension. It sits in the historical record of Nova Scotia as a jagged edge, a series of events that do not fit neatly into the narrative of rural history. It was investigated by the mechanisms of the state, the police, the fire inspectors, and those mechanisms failed. They could not categorize what was happening. They could measure the damage, they could interview the victims, but they could not stop the source. The file was essentially closed, not because the truth was found, but because there was nothing left to do. The family was gone, the fires had stopped, and the snow continued to fall. To reconstruct the scene inside the farmhouse during the height of the activity requires imagining a specific kind of claustrophobia. The windows were likely frosted over with ice, limiting the view to the outside world. The heat would have come from the wood stove, a central point of life that had suddenly become a source of fear. The lighting would have been kerosene lamps or candles casting long, shifting shadows. In this environment, every creak of the floorboards would cause heads to snap around. The smell was a mix of wood smoke, unwashed wool, damp soot, and fierce sweat. The soundscape was dominated by the wind outside and the hushed, tense conversations inside. It was a pressure cooker environment where reality seemed to be fraying at the edges. One particular account from a visiting journalist details a moment of profound stillness before an event. He described sitting in the kitchen with Alexander. The house was quiet, the fire in the stove was low. Suddenly, a heavy metal dipper rose from the water bucket, hovered for a moment in the air, and then dropped with a clatter to the floor. There was no theatricality to it, no spectral voice, just the mundane violation of gravity. The journalist noted that Alexander did not even jump. He simply looked at the dipper with a weary resignation and bent down to pick it up. That reaction speaks volumes about the chronic nature of the haunting. The horror had become routine. The impossible had become a chore. The psychological impact on the community of Caledonia Mills was also significant. The events at the McDonald farm challenged the worldview of the residents. They were religious people, accustomed to viewing the world through the lens of faith and hard work. The intrusion of unexplainable disorder was deeply unsettling. Some turned to prayer, having priests bless the house. Others turned to superstition, reviving old folklore about curses and witchcraft. The farm became a place to be avoided, a dark spot on the map. Even after the family left, the reputation of the land lingered. It was a place where the rules had broken. There is a technical aspect to the fire reports that warrants close attention. The description of cold fire or flames that did not immediately burn is a recurring detail in high strangeness cases, but in 1922, it was simply baffling. Witnesses reported brushing the fire off their clothes with their bare hands without suffering burns. It was only if the fire was allowed to burn for several seconds that it would begin to consume the material and generate heat. This delay in thermal reaction is inconsistent with normal combustion. If a match is touched to cotton, it burns hot immediately. The phenomenon observed at the McDonald farm suggested a different mechanism of ignition, one that perhaps began at a molecular level or involved a form of energy that mimicked fire before becoming it. The investigation also touched upon the possibility of electrical phenomena. It was noted that the air in the house often felt charged, similar to the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. Some researchers have retroactively suggested that the farm may have been sitting on a geological fault or a concentration of mineral deposits that created electromagnetic anomalies. This earth stress theory attempts to ground the paranormal in the physical sciences, suggesting that the fires were a form of ball lightning or static discharge. However, this does not explain the intelligent behavior of the objects or the specific targeting of the family's belongings. Ball lightning does not braid the tails of cows. It does not pull chairs out from under tables. The environmental theories explain the energy, but they do not explain the intent. As the winter turned to spring, the story of the McDonald farm began to fade from the headlines, replaced by other news. The family settled elsewhere, trying to rebuild their lives in anonymity, but the record remains. The police reports exist. The newspaper archives in Halifax and Antigonish hold the daily accounts of the spook farm. It is a testament to the fact that there are events in history that refuse to be solved. They happen, they traumatize, and then they stop, leaving only questions in their wake. The Caledonia Mills mystery is not a story of a crime in the traditional sense. No one was arrested, no motive was ever established. It was simply an intrusion of the inexplicable into the mundane. The house eventually fell into ruin. Nature reclaimed the structure. The wood that had once refused to burn under the strange blue flames eventually rotted into the earth. Today, the location is just another patch of ground in the Nova Scotia wilderness. But for a few weeks in the winter of 1922, it was the center of a storm that defied logic. It was a place where a family sat in the dark, waiting for the next spark, watching their world dismantle itself one piece of wallpaper at a time. The fear they felt was not the fear of a burglar or a storm. It was the primal fear of a reality that is no longer stable. In the end, the narrative of Caledonia Mills serves as a documentation of human resilience in the face of the absurd. Alexander MacDonald stood his ground for as long as he could. He fought a battle he could not understand against an enemy he could not see. When he finally retreated, it was not out of cowardice, but out of a recognition that the rules of engagement were impossibly stacked against him. The case remains one of the most well-documented and least understood poltergeist outbreaks in Canadian history, a cold case in the truest sense of the word. The fire spook of Caledonia Mills. The winter of 1922 in Nova Scotia was punishing even by the standards of the Canadian Maritimes. In the small, dispersed farming community of Caledonia Mills, located in Antigonish County, the snowdrifts were deep enough to bury fence posts, and the wind coming off the Atlantic cut through the thickest wool coats. It was a place where isolation was a fact of life, and where a family's survival depended entirely on their livestock, their wood supply, and the integrity of their shelter. For the MacDonald family, living on a remote farmstead set back from the main road, that integrity was about to be challenged by a series of events that would baffle neighbors, stump local authorities, and eventually draw the attention of international psychic researchers. The events that unfolded over a single week in January were not criminal in nature, at least not in any way that could be prosecuted in a court of law, but they were violent, destructive, and deeply terrifying for the people who lived through them. The central figure in this disturbance was a teenage girl named Mary Ellen, but the force that tore through the MacDonald home seemed to have no respect for persons, property, or the laws of physics. Alexander MacDonald was a hard-working farmer who had lived on the land for years. He was known in the community as a serious man, pragmatic, and grounded in the realities of agricultural life. He lived with his wife and their adopted daughter, Mary Ellen, who was 15 years old at the time. The household was quiet, religious, and entirely unremarkable until the evening of January 7th. The sun had gone down early, as it always does in the northern winter, and the family had settled in for the night. Outside, the temperature was dropping rapidly, but inside the farmhouse, the wood stove was keeping the main rooms bearable. It was around 7 o'clock when Alexander first smelled smoke. In a wooden farmhouse surrounded by snow, fire is the single greatest danger a family can face. It moves fast, consumes everything, and leaves the occupants exposed to the freezing elements. Alexander assumed a spark had jumped from the stove or a piece of kindling had fallen out, but when he went to investigate, he found something that made no sense. The fire was not near the stove. It was in the corner of the room, consuming a piece of wallpaper that had peeled slightly away from the lath and plaster. There was no source of ignition nearby. There were no lamps in that corner, no candles, and the stove was several feet away with its door securely latched. Alexander acted quickly, beating the flames out with his hands and a heavy cloth. He was shaken, but assumed there must be a logical explanation he had missed in his panic. He checked the chimney to ensure there were no cracks leaking heat into the walls, but the masonry was sound. He checked the stovepipes, everything appeared normal. He sat back down, his senses on high alert, listening for the crackle of burning wood. He did not have to wait long. Less than half an hour later, the smell of smoke returned, sharper this time. He followed the scent to an upstairs bedroom, a room that was currently unoccupied and freezing cold. On the bed, a quilt was smoldering. A small patch of flame was eating into the batting. Again, there was no lamp, no candle, and no person in the room. Mary Ellen was downstairs with her mother. Alexander smothered the fire, his heart rate beginning to climb. This was impossible. Fires did not simply start themselves on cold fabrics in unheated rooms. He carried the quilt downstairs and threw it out into the snow, watching it hiss as the heat died out. When he returned inside, the atmosphere in the house had changed. The air felt heavy, charged with a static tension that made the hair on his arms stand up. His wife was anxious, clutching her rosary, while Mary Ellen sat quietly, her eyes wide. They decided to stay up, afraid to sleep, lest they burn to death in their beds. It was a wise decision, because the night was far from over. Over the next few hours, the McDonald farmhouse became a chaotic zone of inexplicable combustion. Fires broke out in rapid succession, sometimes minutes apart. They started in the most illogical places. A wet towel hanging on a rack burst into flames. A pair of curtains in the parlor ignited from the bottom up. Papers inside a closed drawer were found smoldering. Alexander ran from room to room, a bucket of water in hand, fighting a battle against an enemy he could not see. The fires were not large initially, but the frequency was overwhelming. It was as if the house itself was trying to self-destruct. By the early hours of the morning, the family was exhausted and terrified. They had extinguished over a dozen separate fires. The physical evidence was piling up: scorched walls, ruined fabrics, burnt papers, but the cause remained completely invisible. When dawn broke on Sunday, the news of the night's events traveled quickly to the neighboring farms. In a community this tight-knit, distress signals are noticed. Neighbors arrived to find the McDonalds standing outside in the snow, afraid to re-enter their own home. The men of the community, experienced farmers who knew the properties of wood and fire, were skeptical at first. They assumed a chimney fire or a faulty stove. They went inside to inspect the premises, determined to find the structural fault that was endangering their friend. They checked the flues, the attic, and the cellar. They found nothing. And then, while the neighbors were standing in the kitchen discussing the situation, a cushion on a wooden chair suddenly erupted in flames right in front of them. The skepticism in the room evaporated instantly. This was witnessed by sober, reliable men who were not prone to flights of fancy. They patted out the fire, staring at the charred fabric in disbelief. The terror that the McDonalds had felt all night now spread to the community. This was not a mechanical failure. This was something else. The neighbors decided that the house was unsafe, not just because of the fire risk, but because of the uncanny nature of the threat. They helped Alexander move some essential furniture and belongings out into the yard, but even this process was fraught with bizarre occurrences. Items seemed to move on their own. A heavy table was reported to have shifted position without anyone touching it. The livestock in the barn began to panic, kicking at their stalls and making noises that suggested they were in the presence of a predator, yet no animal tracks were found in the snow outside. The family retreated to a neighbor's house for the night, hoping that removing themselves from the location would stop the phenomena. For a brief period, the activities seemed to pause, but the respite was short-lived. When they returned to the farm to tend to the animals, the disturbances started up again with renewed vigor. This time, the phenomena escalated beyond simple fires. Witnesses reported hearing loud thumping noises inside the walls, distinct rhythmic pounding that seemed to follow them from room to room. The sounds were described as being like a heavy mallet striking the wooden beams. Alexander, pushed to the brink of a breakdown, tried to communicate with the source of the noise, shouting at the walls, demanding to know who was doing this. There was no vocal reply, only the relentless, dull thudding. By Tuesday, the story had leaked beyond the immediate community. The local press in Antigonish picked up the thread, and soon reports were being filed for papers in Halifax and beyond. The headlines were sensational, speaking of the fire spook and the ghost of Caledonia Mills. This attention brought a new wave of visitors to the farm: curiosity seekers, amateur detectives, and law enforcement. The local authorities were in a difficult position. There was clearly property damage, which is a police matter, but there was no suspect and no weapon. Detective Carroll, a seasoned officer, was dispatched to investigate. He arrived expecting to find a prankster or a pyromaniac. What he found was a house in a state of siege. The detective interviewed the family separately. He looked for matches, lighters, or chemicals. He examined Mary Ellen's hands for burns or soot. He found nothing incriminating, but he did witness the aftermath of the events. He saw the scorched spots on the wallpaper that were too high for a person to reach without a ladder. He saw the sheer volume of burnt material, the sheer logistics of a single person setting 30 or 40 fires in a few hours without being seen by the 3 other people in the house seemed impossible. Yet, as is common in these cases, suspicion began to drift toward the teenager. Mary Ellen was at the age often associated with poltergeist activity adolescence, a time of hormonal and psychological change. Some of the neighbors began to whisper that she was the cause, possibly unconsciously. The phenomena took a stranger turn when physical contact began to be reported. During a gathering at the house where several neighbors were keeping watch, Alexander suddenly cried out that he had been slapped. A red mark appeared on his forearm, visible to everyone present. Mary Ellen, who was sitting across the room, claimed that something had pulled her hair. A neighbor reported feeling a cold hand brush against the back of his neck. The terror was no longer just about the house burning down, it was about an invisible, physical presence that could touch and hurt them. The atmosphere in the farmhouse was described as suffocating. Witnesses said the air felt thick and cold, even when the stove was roaring. The family was living in a state of high adrenaline exhaustion, sleeping in shifts, eating little, and jumping at every creak of the floorboards. One of the most disturbing incidents occurred in the barn. Alexander and a neighbor went out to milk the cows. They found the animals in a state of absolute hysteria. The cows were sweating despite the freezing cold, their eyes rolling in their heads. When Alexander tried to approach them, he was thrown back by an unseen force. He described it not as a push, but as a wall of energy that physically repelled him. The milk pails were overturned. The 2 men retreated to the house, bolting the door behind them. It was becoming clear that the farm was no longer habitable. The family moved out entirely, staying with relatives, effectively abandoning their home to the entity. The case caught the attention of Dr. Walter Franklin Prince, a prominent researcher from the American Society for Psychical Research. Prince was not a gullible ghost hunter. He was a man of science, a skeptic who had debunked countless frauds. He traveled to Nova Scotia, braving the winter travel conditions, determined to get to the bottom of the Caledonia Mills mystery. His arrival changed the tone of the events from a local folklore horror to a documented case study. Prince approached the situation like a crime scene investigator. He cataloged the fires, interviewed the witnesses, and most importantly, he focused his attention on Mary Ellen. Prince's theory was rooted in the psychology of the time. He suspected that Mary Ellen was a poltergeist medium, a person who, through intense psychological stress or dissociation, projects energy that causes physical disturbances. Or, more prosaically, that she was entering a trance state and setting the fires herself without conscious memory of doing so. To test this, he set up controlled experiments. He had Mary Ellen sit in a chair in the middle of the room, her hands visible. He watched her for hours. During these periods of observation, the activity decreased significantly, which Prince noted. However, as soon as attention was diverted, a fire would break out in another room. One afternoon, while Prince was in the kitchen, a fire started in the upstairs hallway. He rushed up the stairs and found a pile of old clothes burning. Mary Ellen was downstairs, verified by her mother. Unless she had an accomplice, which seemed unlikely given the isolation and the scrutiny, she physically could not have lit that fire. Prince was stumped by the logistics. He examined the burn patterns. They were consistent with rapid ignition, almost explosive in nature. There was no smell of kerosene or gasoline. It was just dry fabric catching fire spontaneously. Prince also noted the blue light phenomenon reported by the family. They claimed to see flashes of blue light darting through the rooms just before a fire would start. Prince never saw the lights himself, but he recorded the consistent testimony of multiple independent witnesses. The investigation revealed the deep psychological strain on Mary Ellen. She was an adopted child in a strict household, living in a harsh environment. The experts speculated that the fire spook was an externalization of her internal turmoil. But this explanation, while satisfying to the academics, did nothing to stop the fires. The activity continued for a solid week, destroying bedding, clothes, furniture, and parts of the structure. The house was left scarred and smelling of smoke and fear. The community was divided. Some believed it was the work of the devil and wanted an exorcism. Others believed it was a hoax and wanted Mary Ellen arrested. The police, unable to prove a crime, eventually backed off, leaving the family to deal with the aftermath. The climax of the events came when the phenomena followed Mary Ellen off the property. She was sent to stay with another family member in a different town, hoping to break the connection. Reports followed that small fires broke out in that house as well, though with less frequency. This supported the theory that the haunting was attached to the person, not the location. However, back at the McDonald farm, Alexander reported that even with Mary Ellen gone, the house still felt wrong. He heard footsteps on the upper floor when the house was empty. He found doors open that he had locked. The energy of the place had been permanently altered. Dr. Prince eventually concluded his investigation. His report was a masterpiece of ambiguity. He acknowledged that he could not explain all the fires through normal means. He admitted that the timeline of events made fraud extremely difficult. However, he stopped short of declaring it a genuine supernatural event. He classified it as a case of presumptive poltergeist activity centering on the adolescent agent. He left Nova Scotia, leaving the mystery unsolved. The McDonalds eventually moved back into their home, but life never returned to normal. They lived with the constant fear that the fires would return. They kept buckets of water in every room for years. The local legacy of the fire spook remained strong for decades. The farm became a place to be avoided after dark. The story was told and retold not as a fun campfire tale, but as a warning about the unknown forces that can inhabit the domestic spaces we think are safe. The most chilling aspect of the case was the intelligence that the fires seemed to possess. They didn't just burn, they targeted. They targeted the family's comfort, their bedclothes, their towels, their furniture. It felt personal. It felt like an attack. Mary Ellen's life was forever marked by the events of that winter. She was looked at with suspicion by her neighbors for years. In a small community, being the center of a witchcraft panic is a heavy burden. She eventually faded into obscurity, the details of her later life largely unrecorded, but for that 1 week in 1922, she was the lightning rod for a force that defied explanation. The fires eventually stopped as abruptly as they had begun, fading away into the end of winter, leaving behind only scorched wood and questions that have never been adequately answered. One detail that often gets lost in the retelling is the specific nature of the sounds recorded by the witnesses. It wasn't just thumping. Several people, including a visiting priest, reported hearing a sound like wet wings flapping against the windows at night. This auditory detail adds a layer of strangeness that moves the case beyond simple telekinesis or pyrokinesis. It suggests something visiting, something trying to get in. The combination of the elemental fire and the biological sounds of wings created a sensory nightmare for the people trapped in that snowbound house. The skepticism of the modern era often dismisses these historical cases as mass hysteria or simple fraud, but the Caledonia Mills case resists easy dismissal because of the sheer number of witnesses. These were not people primed to believe in ghosts. They were Scottish Catholic farmers, practical and tough. They had no incentive to make up a story that would bring them ridicule and unwanted attention. They lost property. They lost their peace of mind. They gained nothing but notoriety. The police files, the newspaper archives, and the report by the American Society for Psychical Research all exist as tangible proof that something happened. In the years that followed, other fire poltergeist cases would pop up around the world, but few had the intensity or the concentrated timeline of the McDonald haunting. It stands as a benchmark for this specific type of paranormal phenomenon. The image of Alexander McDonald standing in his freezing bedroom, watching a fire start on a quilt with no match and no lighter, remains a potent symbol of the fragility of our understanding of the world. We build walls to keep the cold out, to keep the wild out, but we have no defense against a fire that starts from the inside, ignited by forces we cannot see and do not understand. Even the layout of the house seemed to play a role. It was a standard timber frame construction, 2 stories, with a central staircase. The fires often clustered around this central artery, moving up and down the stairs as if the entity was using the hallway to travel. The bedroom of Mary Ellen was a hotspot, but so was the parlor, the room meant for guests and propriety. The violation of these private and public spaces within the home struck at the heart of the family structure. The spook didn't just burn things, it dismantled the idea of the home as a sanctuary. The weather during that week in January played a crucial role in the horror. If it had been summer, the family could have slept in the barn or outside. But with temperatures well below freezing, they were trapped. They were forced to stay in the building that was attacking them. The snow acted as a prison wall. This environmental factor ramped up the tension to unbearable levels. Every time they put out a fire, they knew they had to stay put and wait for the next one. They couldn't leave. The psychological toll of that entrapment cannot be overstated. There was also a curious lack of heat in the initial moments of the fires. Witnesses reported that when they grabbed the burning fabrics, the flames were hot, but the surrounding air didn't have that superheated quality one expects from a house fire. It was as if the fire was localized, contained within a specific energetic pocket until it consumed enough fuel to become a normal fire. This detail appears in other poltergeist cases, suggesting a manipulation of physics that bypasses normal thermal dynamics. It allowed the family to put out the fires with their hands or small amounts of water, provided they caught them early enough. The investigation by the authorities was notably fruitless. Detective Peebles, sometimes referred to as Carroll in different accounts, as multiple officers visited, was a man who dealt in facts. He looked for the mechanism. He tore up floorboards looking for wires. He checked the attic for hidden crawl spaces where an accomplice could hide. He found nothing. His frustration is palpable in the reports. He knew a crime was happening, arson is a crime, but he couldn't find the criminal. The law has no handcuffs for a ghost. The failure of the police to solve the case added to the community's belief that this was a supernatural event. If the law couldn't explain it, then the church or the folklore must be the answer. As the weeks turned into months, the story of the fire spook began to fade from the headlines, replaced by other news. But for the people of Antigonish County, it remained a vivid memory. The McDonald farm stood as a monument to the event. People would drive by slowly, looking at the windows, wondering if they would see a flash of blue light or a curtain bursting into flame. The story became part of the regional identity, a reminder that in the lonely corners of the world, the rules of reality are not always as fixed as we would like them to be. Today, the site of the haunting is quiet. The original farmhouse is gone, reclaimed by time and the elements. The snow still falls just as heavily in January, covering the fields where Alexander McDonald once struggled to save his livelihood from an invisible arsonist. The wind still howls off the Atlantic, sounding to the imaginative ear, a bit like wet wings flapping against a window pane. The mystery of what exactly happened in that house in 1922 remains locked in the past, preserved in the yellowed pages of old newspapers and the fading memories of a community that once looked into the face of the inexplicable and saw it looking back, holding a match that wasn't there. The enduring question is not just how the fires started, but why. If it was Mary Ellen, what was happening in her mind to trigger such a violent projection? If it was an external entity, what did it want? The fires never burned the house to the ground. They seemed designed to torment rather than to destroy completely. They were a form of communication, a hot, bright language of distress that no one could translate. And until we understand the mechanism of such things, the fire spook of Caledonia Mills waits in the dark, a dormant potentiality in every creaking house and every troubled mind. One final aspect that researchers often discuss is the contagion effect. During the height of the disturbances, other families in the area reported minor oddities, pictures falling off walls, strange knocks. It was as if the energy at the McDonald farm was spilling over, infecting the surrounding reality. This suggests that whatever was happening was not just a localized haunting, but a tear in the fabric of the local environment, a weak point where the irrational could bleed through. This radius of effect terrified the neighbors more than the fires themselves. Fire you can fight with water, a spreading invisible influence you can only endure. The McDonalds were ordinary people thrust into an extraordinary nightmare. They didn't ask for fame, they didn't sell tickets, they just wanted to sleep through the night without burning. Their ordeal is a testament to human resilience in the face of the uncanny. They stood their ground, they fought the fires, and they survived. But the silence that followed the fires was the loudest sound of all the silence of a mystery that simply stopped, offering no closure, no apology, and no explanation. It just ended, leaving the world a little stranger and a little darker than it was before. The Dag farmhouse disturbances of 1889. The events that took place in the late autumn of 1889 at a farmhouse in Clarendon, Quebec, remain some of the most meticulously documented instances of unexplained physical phenomena in Canadian history. The location was a modest, rough-cast log house situated about 7 miles from the town of Shawville, deep in the Ottawa Valley. It was the home of George Dag, a 30-year-old farmer who was well regarded in the community as a hardworking and sober man. He lived there with his wife Susan and their 2 young children, a 4-year-old daughter and a 2-year-old son. Also living in the house was an 11-year-old girl named Dinah Burden McLean. Dinah had been sent to the Dag farm from a grand Scottish home for orphaned children in Ontario to help Susan with domestic chores and child rearing. For the first few years of her stay, life at the farm was entirely ordinary. The family worked the land, attended the local church, and lived a quiet existence typical of rural Quebec in the late 19th century. There were no stories of ghosts, no local legends attached to the property, and no reason to suspect that the Dag farm would soon become the center of a media storm that would draw witnesses from across the county. The disturbance began on a Sunday morning, the 15th of September, 1889. George Dag was preparing to head out to the fields when he handed a $5 bill to his wife Susan. She took the money and placed it inside a drawer in a bureau located in the main living area. It was a secure spot, and no one else was in the room at the time. A short while later, Susan returned to the drawer to retrieve the money, but it was gone. She searched the drawer and the surrounding area, assuming she had simply misplaced it. George and Susan searched the room together, moving furniture and checking pockets, but the bill had vanished. They were baffled, but eventually decided it must have been lost through carelessness. This minor incident, which seemed like a simple domestic annoyance at the time, was the first sign that the environment within the farmhouse was beginning to shift. Later that same day, a neighbor named Mrs. Smart came to visit. She and Susan were sitting in the kitchen when they suddenly heard the sound of liquid splashing onto the floor. They looked over to see a milk pan, which had been sitting securely on a shelf, lying upside down on the floorboards. The milk had spilled everywhere. Both women were certain that no one had been near the shelf. They cleaned up the mess, unsettled but unwilling to jump to conclusions. Over the next few weeks, the activity in the house escalated from minor annoyances to aggressive physical disruptions. Objects began to move on their own with increasing frequency. A jar of pickles that had been stored in the pantry was found smashed on the floor of the kitchen, despite the pantry door being closed. Utensils would be found in rooms where they did not belong. The family initially suspected that one of the children might be playing pranks, and suspicion naturally fell on young Dinah as she was the oldest child in the house. George Dagg questioned her strictly, but she denied touching the items. The atmosphere in the house grew tense. George was a practical man who did not believe in the supernatural, and he was determined to find a rational explanation for the disorder overtaking his home. He began to monitor the children closely, watching their movements to catch them in the act. However, the phenomena continued even when all the children were accounted for and under direct observation. The situation took a dangerous turn in early November. On a particularly cold afternoon, the family noticed a smell of smoke drifting through the house. They rushed to the parlor and found a small fire burning on the floor. It appeared to have started spontaneously, with no coal or ember from the fireplace nearby. They stomped it out quickly, confused about how it could have ignited. Within hours, another fire broke out in a bedroom upstairs. This time, the curtains were ablaze. The fires were small and localized, almost as if they were being set by an invisible hand, but they were frequent enough to pose a serious threat to the wooden structure of the farmhouse. Over the course of a single day, 8 distinct fires erupted in different parts of the house. George and Susan were running from room to room with buckets of water, terrified that their home would burn to the ground. The strange thing about these fires was their behavior. Witnesses later described them as flaring up with an unnatural intensity, but being relatively easy to extinguish if caught immediately. It was not the slow smolder of an electrical issue or a chimney spark, but a sudden, violent combustion of fabric or wood. News of the fires spread quickly to the neighboring farms. In a close-knit rural community, a family in distress brought immediate assistance. Neighbors arrived to help the Daggs keep watch, acting as a volunteer fire brigade. Among them were respected members of the community, including William Dagg, George's brother, and Arthur Smart. These men were skeptical farmers, not prone to flights of fancy. They arrived expecting to find a logical cause, perhaps a mischievous child with matches or a faulty stovepipe. What they witnessed left them unable to provide a conventional explanation. On one occasion, while several neighbors were present in the kitchen, a large stone smashed through the window from the outside, shattering the glass. The men rushed outside to catch the culprit, assuming it was a vandal. They circled the house and checked the surrounding fields, but the snow was fresh and undisturbed. There were no footprints leading to or from the window. When they returned inside, another stone flew through a different window. This time, the stone did not just land on the floor, it seemed to roll across the room with intention. The physical bombardment continued for days. Stones, some weighing several pounds, were hurled at the house from empty fields. Inside, potatoes and other vegetables would lift from their bins and fly across the room, striking the walls or the witnesses. Crucially, the witnesses reported that the objects did not travel with the high velocity of a thrown projectile, but often floated or curved in the air before making impact. On one documented occasion, a heavy wash basin was seen to lift off its stand and crash to the floor while everyone in the room was standing several feet away from it. The focus of the activity seemed to drift toward Dinah. Whenever the young girl was present, the phenomena became more violent. A jug of water was seen to pour itself over her head, soaking her clothes while she stood crying in the center of the room. The neighbors, initially suspicious of her, began to realize that she was the target rather than the perpetrator. They watched as she was slapped by unseen hands, leaving red marks on her face. Her hair was pulled by an invisible force, snapping her head back while she sat in a chair with her hands in her lap. By the middle of November, the haunting had evolved beyond simple telekinesis. A sound began to permeate the farmhouse, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It started as animalistic noises, like the barking of a dog or the squealing of a pig, but soon articulated into human speech. The voice was described as gruff and masculine, distinct from the voice of anyone living in the house. It would shout obscenities and taunt the family. It seemed to have a particular hatred for George Dagg, mocking his attempts to control the situation. The voice was loud enough to be heard clearly by everyone in the room, and it would engage in direct conversation with the witnesses. When a neighbor asked who it was, the voice would reply with nonsensical names or claim to be the devil. It showed an uncanny knowledge of the private lives of the people present, revealing secrets and embarrassing details about the neighbors that the Dagg family could not possibly have known. This psychological aspect of the haunting terrified the community even more than the fires. The notoriety of the Dagg haunting attracted the attention of Percy Woodcock, a well-known artist and amateur researcher of spiritualism from Brockville, Ontario. Woodcock arrived at the farm in late November, determined to document the case with scientific rigor. He was not a credulous man. He was looking for evidence of fraud or trickery. Upon his arrival, he was subjected to the same barrage of phenomena that the locals had reported. He watched as a butter tub was hurled down the stairs and saw a piece of wood fly across the room and strike a wall. Woodcock decided to conduct a series of tests to verify the source of the voice. He isolated Dinah, believing that she might be unconsciously throwing her voice. He placed her in a chair and had her fill her mouth with water. While her mouth was full and her lips were sealed, the gruff voice continued to speak from the corner of the room, insulting Woodcock and laughing at his experiments. Woodcock later wrote that the voice had a distinct spatial quality. It did not sound like it was coming from Dinah's throat, but rather from the air above her head or from the empty space in the center of the room. Woodcock spent several days living with the Dagg family. During this time, the entity's behavior began to shift. It went from aggressive and violent to strangely conversational. It engaged in long theological debates with Woodcock, displaying a level of intelligence and vocabulary that was inconsistent with the education of an 11-year-old farm girl. The entity claimed to be a discarnate spirit, though its identity remained fluid and contradictory. It would sometimes sing hymns in a beautiful, high-pitched voice that was completely different from the gruff persona it usually adopted. This angelic voice was melodic and pure, and witnesses reported feeling a sense of calm when it sang, a stark contrast to the fear induced by the growling. Woodcock documented these sessions meticulously, noting the time of day, the atmospheric conditions, and the specific witnesses present for each event. He was particularly struck by an incident where he asked the entity to retrieve a specific object from another room. Moments later, the object, a pencil, came floating through the air and landed gently at his feet. The climax of the haunting occurred on the 17th of November, 1889. By this point, the farmhouse had become a hub of activity, with dozens of people stopping by daily to hear the voice. The strain on the Dagg family was immense. Susan was exhausted, George was at his wit's end, and Dinah was in a state of constant anxiety. On that Sunday, the entity announced that it would be leaving. The voice, now speaking in a softer tone, called out to each member of the family by name. It apologized for the trouble it had caused, specifically addressing George Dagg and asking for his forgiveness. It then turned its attention to Dinah. The relationship between the entity and the girl had been complex. It had tormented her physically, but now seemed to express a strange sort of affection. It told her to be a good girl and promised not to hurt her anymore. Following these farewells, the witnesses in the room heard what they described as the sound of beautiful music drifting away into the distance, fading until the house was completely silent. In the immediate aftermath, Percy Woodcock knew that the story would be met with disbelief by the outside world. To counter the inevitable skepticism, he drafted a formal statement detailing the events he had witnessed. He gathered 17 of the most credible witnesses, including George Dagg, his family, and several prominent neighbors who had spent significant time at the house during the disturbances. These 17 people signed a statutory declaration swearing that the events they had seen, the fires, the moving objects, and the disembodied voices were real and not the result of trickery or hallucination. This document, published in the local newspaper, the Shawville Equity, remains one of the most compelling pieces of evidence in the history of the case. It was a rare instance of a community putting their reputations on the line to vouch for the impossible. The signatories were not seeking fame, they were simply attesting to the reality of the trauma they had endured. Despite the entity's departure, the Dagg family did not immediately find peace. The psychological toll of the haunting was significant. They continued to live in the farmhouse, but the atmosphere had changed permanently. Every creak of the floorboards or gust of wind against the window was now a cause for alarm. The community, too, was changed. The Dagg farm became a place of local legend, avoided by some and gawked at by others. Dinah Burden McLean, the epicenter of the activity, eventually moved away from the farm. Little is known about her life after the haunting, though some reports suggest she grew up to live a quiet, normal life, never speaking publicly about the terror she had experienced as a child. The lack of recurring phenomena around her in later years supports the theory that the haunting was tied specifically to the location or the specific dynamic at the Dagg farm during that autumn of 1889, rather than being attached to Dinah herself. The investigation into the Dagg haunting never yielded a conclusive explanation. Skeptics at the time, and in the years since, have proposed various theories. Some suggested that Dinah was a gifted ventriloquist and magician who orchestrated the entire event to gain attention. This theory, however, fails to account for the multiple fires starting simultaneously in different rooms, or the sheer physical strength required to throw heavy stones through windows while under the watchful eyes of adults. Others suggested that George Dagg or the neighbors were complicit in a hoax, perhaps to drive up the value of the land or simply to entertain themselves during the long winter. Yet, the Dagg family gained nothing from the ordeal. In fact, they suffered property damage, lost valuable livestock feed to the disturbances, and endured the intrusion of strangers into their private lives. There was no financial motive, and the terror expressed by the witnesses was universally described as genuine. One detail that often gets overlooked in summaries of the case is the specific nature of the physical evidence left behind. The glass from the broken windows did not just fall, it was pulverized. The stones that were thrown into the house were often hot to the touch, suggesting they had been subjected to energy or friction that could not be explained by a simple toss from the yard. Furthermore, the writings that appeared on the walls during the height of the activity were inexplicable. Scrawlings would appear on the rough logs of the interior walls, sometimes mere scribbles, but occasionally legible words. These messages were often nonsensical or repetitive, mirroring the chaotic nature of the voice. Attempts to scrub them off were difficult, and in some cases, the markings would reappear overnight. This physical residue of the haunting served as a constant reminder to the family that what they were experiencing was not a shared delusion. The Dagg case stands apart from other historical hauntings because of the sheer number of witnesses and the public nature of the phenomena. It was not a ghost story told by a single frightened person in the dark. It was a communal event experienced in broad daylight by sensible, rural people. The Dag poltergeist, as it came to be known, challenged the worldview of everyone who encountered it. It forced strict Presbyterians to confront the possibility of spirits that did not fit neatly into their religious framework. It forced skeptics to admit that their senses could not be trusted. The involvement of Percy Woodcock added a layer of objective observation that is rare in 19th century accounts. His refusal to accept the supernatural without testing it, and his eventual conversion to a believer in the face of overwhelming evidence, adds weight to the testimony. Even today, the narrative of the Dag haunting contains elements that defy easy categorization. The transformation of the entity from a violent, fire-starting force to a singing, philosophical presence is unusual in the annals of poltergeist lore. Most cases simply fade away or escalate until the victim leaves. The Dag entity seemed to undergo a character arc, engaging with its audience and eventually making a conscious decision to depart. This intelligence, this responsiveness to the humans around it, suggests a level of interaction that goes beyond mere kinetic energy. It implies a consciousness that was observing the family just as closely as the family was observing it. The voice's ability to cite specific details about the neighbors' debts they owed, private arguments they had with their spouses, implies a surveillance that is deeply unsettling. It suggests that the entity had access to information that was completely inaccessible to Dinah or the Dag family. The final days of the haunting were marked by a strange melancholy. Witnesses reported that as the voice became less aggressive, the physical atmosphere of the house became heavier, as if the air itself was thick with static. The departure on November 17 was not a sudden vanishing, but a gradual withdrawal. The family sat in the parlor for hours after the music faded, afraid to move, waiting for the next stone to fall or the next fire to spark. When the sun rose the next morning, the silence in the house was absolute. The fires had stopped. The stones lay where they had fallen in the yard. The Dag family resumed their routine, milking the cows and tending the fields, but the normalcy was a veneer. They had lived through a rupture in reality, a 2-month period where the laws of physics had been suspended. In the years that followed, the story of the Dag haunting was passed down through the generations in the Ottawa Valley. It became a piece of local folklore, but unlike many legends that grow more exaggerated with time, the Dag story has remained remarkably consistent, largely due to the existence of the sworn affidavit. The document lists the names of the witnesses: George Dag, Susan Dag, Mary Dag, John Dag, Arthur Smart, Mrs. Smart, William H. Dag, and others. These were real people with gravestones that can still be found in the local cemeteries. They were not characters in a novel. They were farmers, wives, and neighbors who experienced something they could not understand and felt compelled to write it down so that others would believe them. The farmhouse itself did not survive the passage of time. Like many wooden structures of that era, it eventually succumbed to the elements and was reclaimed by the landscape. Today, the site where the Dag house stood is indistinguishable from the surrounding fields. There is no marker to indicate that this was the site of one of Canada's most intense paranormal episodes. However, the records remain. The archived copies of the Shawville Equity, the letters written by Percy Woodcock, and the oral histories of the Dag descendants preserve the memory of those dark months in 1889. The case remains an open question, a jagged piece of history that refuses to fit into the puzzle of the rational world. It serves as a reminder that even in the most ordinary of places, a quiet log cabin in the snow-covered fields of Quebec, the barrier between the known and the unknown can sometimes become terrifyingly thin. Researching the Dag haunting requires navigating a landscape of skepticism and belief. The modern researcher must look at the sociological context of the time. It was an era where spiritualism was gaining traction, yet the people of Clarendon were practical, religious, and generally removed from such urban fads. This makes their testimony arguably more reliable, as they had no cultural incentive to fabricate a ghost story. In fact, admitting to such disturbances likely brought them embarrassment and unwanted scrutiny from their church. George Dagg, in particular, was described as a man who just wanted to farm his land in peace. The stress visible in his accounts and the sheer exhaustion described by visitors points to a genuine crisis. They were not enjoying the attention, they were enduring a siege. The enduring mystery of the Dagg haunting is not just what caused the fires or who spoke with the gruff voice, it is the question of what happens when a community is confronted with the irrational. In 1889, the people of Clarendon chose to face it together. They did not shun the Dagg family, they packed into the farmhouse to witness the impossible. They signed their names to a legal document to validate their neighbor's experience. In doing so, they left behind a record that defies dismissal. The Dagg poltergeist remains a singular event, a moment when the impossible stepped into the parlor of a Quebec farmhouse, sat down, and spoke for 2 months before vanishing into the winter air, leaving only silence and scorched floorboards in its wake.